bachelor degrees, and the other was on computational intelligence stream. And since 2010, he's doing his PhD, it's a combined. Oh. Okay, determined people. Please come in. Here are 3 more seats. There's another one over there, and there's a seat. Yes, ma'am. You don't need a chair? Okay. Here's one more chair if you need one. So I was just introducing Mr. Renz. At the moment he's doing is in a PhD program, computer science, between the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the RWTH Aachen. So you have the floor.
Thank you for the introduction. I hope to, well, first let me say thank you all for coming to my lecture. I hope to introduce you in a very broad sense to the subject of artificial intelligence. I'll try not to bore you with too many particular details, but just give a layperson's idea of what the subject is all about. If you have any more technical questions, we can talk about it afterwards.
I'll do that, wait.
So I'm going to approach the introduction to the subject of artificial intelligence by way of looking at agents. Of course, there are many ways of using the methods of artificial intelligence. However, the agent approach is nice, gives it a nice context to build and to introduce all the concepts in one subject. So for those of you that don't understand English too well, I've given the slides in German, but I'll explain everything in English as well. As it says here, agents should be able to recognize different situations and options. They should be able to make decisions. Ideally, they should not depend on human interaction, but sometimes they do require human interaction. Agents should be able to interact with their world or their environment. So, for example, one of those robots you find in the factories in Japan or in the United States sometimes, those robots, those robot arms, should know their environment and be able to act and know what their limits are. And of course, robots and software agents require computers and software and a lot of mathematics, unfortunately. Or fortunately, if you're a mathematician. And then, to summarize, they need artificial intelligence. By the way, when I talk about agents, I don't mean just physical robots, but also software agents like avatars that you find in games or that fly around in virtual worlds. They also need their own intelligence sometimes. All agents need to be able to represent their knowledge somehow, so that they can make decisions and interact with their world and be useful. So I'm going to explain the idea of knowledge representation using 2 basic approaches, but there are other approaches and more fine-grained distinctions. The first 2 lines here describe shortly the one approach, and I'll describe this first and then I'll describe the second approach. So the first approach talks about more graphical representation of knowledge, and this concerns what we call states, and each state can be represented about attributes. So like the previous speaker was talking about features or attributes that can be recognized against the wall. For example, the door handle or a light switch, those are attributes. And given a certain amount of attributes, one can describe different states. So one state might have a certain attribute and another state might not have an attribute. And then all the combinations of whether an attribute is present or not results in a state space, what we call a state space. So also, given certain actions that agents can perform, there are transitions between these states. And diagrammatically, this might be one representation of a very simple situation where we have two features or two attributes, P and Q, whatever those might be. It might be, for example, there's a light switch, the light switch is on and the fan is on. So this tilde here means it's the negation or the absence of this attribute. So in this state, this circle means there's a state where the light is off and the fan is on, and this state is both the light and the fan are off, and so on. And so given two attributes, we can describe four states. This is a very simple example. These arrows describe in a certain domain how the agent could move between states given certain actions. And I've arbitrarily chosen to model this, the agent's domain, so that it always starts. So these double circles mean these are the states where an agent can start off initially. And given where the agent starts, it can transition to any state where Q is true. So you'll see there's no way to get to a state where Q is false. So in this example, the agent can never go to a state where the fan is off. And it always starts in states where the light is on. So it can start in states where lights are on, and it can only move to states where the fan is on. Coming to the second approach, I'm going to try to explain how the same system can be modeled using logical sentences. And logical sentences are much more compact way to represent the same kind of knowledge, but not as intuitive as diagrams, although a computer finds it difficult to understand diagrams, whereas computers find it easy usually to understand logical sentences. Unfortunately, humans tend not to understand logical sentences. So people involved in my field have the task of translating more intuitive diagrams into logical sentences and trying to understand them themselves to know what the computer will do with those sentences. So this is supposed to represent what I showed you previously with the states. And you can see it's much more compact, and this is not even needed because I've just added this for your enjoyment. The tilde here, as I said, means not. This wedge symbol means and it's interesting that in logical terms you can define OR, which is this V symbol, in terms of just these two symbols. So OR is defined as not A and not B, where A and B are called propositions. So for the example, A could be P and B could be Q. And in fact, in logical terms, one can describe saying the light is on or the fan is on using symbols or the ideas of not and. You don't even need or. And likewise, this arrow represents implication. So one would read a sentence like this: if P, then Q, or P implies Q. And again, you can define the symbol implication using the not symbol and the or symbol. And the or symbol can again be broken down into the not and the and symbol. I don't expect you to understand or remember it all, but it's just interesting, I thought. And I would like to note here that, or draw your attention to the fact that P here stands alone, so that means it's a fact in this domain, and that's why in the previous diagram, which I'll show you again, the P appears in the states where the agent initially starts. And this represents those arrows. It means for any state in which P is true, the agent will move to a state where Q is true. And this is a much more compact representation of this kind of diagram. But unfortunately, as I said, computers don't understand pictures. They need symbols. So, argumentación here means in English reasoning, and not argumentation. So, here, this approach, or argumentation, can be broken down in this lecture to two kinds again. One using the diagrams I've showed, and one using logical sentences. So the first approach would look through a graph to find its goals. So if you put reasoning into terms of looking for states that are desired by an agent, for example, goal states. So looking for a state where, for example, the fan is on. Then given where the agent starts off, you would have certain strategies for searching through the diagram, going via those arrows, and then looking for states, and then deciding which actions should be taken. In reality, these diagrams become very large, and a computer can take days to make a decision of which actions to perform. So in the field of AI, people have started using rules called heuristics, or rules of thumb, to cut away certain parts of those diagrams and not search through them, when it knows that if it searches deeply into those diagrams, it will not get to the goal. And given certain rules, for example, if you know that if you see a black spot on the fan that's hanging from the ceiling, then you probably know it's fused or it's broken, and you don't even have to try and get an action to get it to turn, because you know it's broken. So then you wouldn't look further into that kind of situation. But seeing that robots and computers and agents use logical sentences more, or symbolic approaches, we need approaches that also can deal with logical sentences. And this is called theorem proving. And one usually has a database of what we call axioms, which are sentences in logical form. And these are sentences that are always valid, or always true. And then one of the major approaches to decide whether a certain sentence is true so that an agent can make a decision is to use theorem proving by contradiction. And what this means is that an agent might have an hypothesis of what is possible. Then it wants to know whether this hypothesis is always true or not. Then it negates this sentence, saying it's not true, and tries to prove that this negated sentence can never be true. And if it has proven that the negated sentence can never be true, then it knows the original sentence has to be true, always. And so it has proven validity of some sentence. Since the beginning of research into AI, uncertainty has always been a problem. So uncertainty is basically when you do an action and you don't know what the effects are going to be. There might be three effects. So, for example, you put on the fan, it might go on, but it might not turn on because it might be faulty, or it might even spin out of its socket and fall on the ground for some reason. To model these uncertainties, again, there are various approaches. And in robotics especially, where the robot's actuators are very uncertain or unstable, or it might be, for example, a moon rover might be slipping on the ground, and the agent that is controlling the moon rover has to know and take into account what the possibilities for errors are. And in its reasoning, it has to have models for what to do given its knowledge of its uncertainty. And this is what we also do every day. I mean, when you try to open the door, you subconsciously perhaps know that you have to, that the first time you press the handle, it might not open. Or, for example, you don't know whether to ziehen or to drukken. So it is not a sticker. And you have to keep this in mind because, for example, you do a quick test to push, and then if you see it doesn't go, then you pull. Whereas if you had to first reason about it, you would stand there for a minute thinking what to do next. So if you have uncertainty built into your reasoning, you can react very fast. To go into a bit more detail about uncertainty, I just want to focus on these bottom 3 points. Given certain events, one can predict the probabilities of causes or future events. So given a set of possible events, like the fan will go on or it will be off, or the light will be on or off, one can ask what is the probability of certain events occurring all simultaneously. And you can say, for example, okay, I want to know what is the probability, given I have a certain model, of whether the light will be on and the fan will be off, and for various combinations of those. But again, there's so many possibilities of how to compute these probabilities that it becomes cumbersome for a computer to do quickly. And usually we want agents to think fast and on the feet. So some clever people have thought of ideas to model probabilities and causes of probabilities using what we call belief networks. And they appeal to the rule of Bayes, or Bayes' rule, which was a monk interest to me. A few hundred years ago, they started doing some experiments on plants and looking at probabilities. And that is basically Bayes' rule, which says the probability of some event or hypothesis H, given the evidence, is equal to the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis times the probability of the prior probability of the hypothesis divided by the probability of that evidence occurring. It's not very easy to understand if you haven't seen it before, but I thought I'd show you anyway. Basically, this formula, when you put in all the information for a larger model, this equation just blows up very large. And these computations can take several hours if you don't use certain heuristics and tricks. And one of those tricks is to use belief networks. And then using the notion of independence, unabhängigkeit, one can see the relationship between different events in a probabilistic sense. So in this diagram, this is what they call this is a belief network for a certain domain, where there's a building and there's a possible fire, and if enough people know about the fire, they'll all leave the building, and someone has to then give a report of whether there was a fire or not. And there's also a smoke sensor, and the smoke sensor could be broken, so there are probabilities attached to the smoke sensor for whether it can be trusted or not. There's even one can put a probability on whether the report is accurate. For example, the people that compile the report could be drunk, or they could be teenagers that are mucking around and they've been given a task that they shouldn't have been given. And one might ask, say now there's 20 people in a building, would one say when 10 people have left, the people are leaving the building, or is it just coincidence that 10 people have left the building? So when 15 people are leaving the building, then one might start thinking something strange is going on. Why is everyone leaving at the same time? So one could add probabilities to this idea of leaving. So for example, it's probably 99% sure that people are leaving due to a fire if all 20 people have left the building at the same time. But if 5% are leaving the building at the same time, it's more probable that they're going on lunch. So here we see that one can factorize the dependence of certain events in this format, which is very much simpler than having every event, all these events, all dependent on each other. Because if that was so, we would have an arrow from each of these ellipses to each other ellipse, and that would make things very complex. So using Bayes' rule and the notion of independence, one can say that the event alarm depends only on tampering, which means tampering of the fire sensor, or the alarm mechanism, and it depends on fire, but it depends on nothing else. And smoke, the smoke detector only depends on whether there's a fire. It doesn't depend on whether people are leaving. And that's quite obvious. I mean, if there's smoke, the smoke doesn't care whether people are leaving. There's just smoke because there's something wrong. There's a fire. So one can sometimes quite obviously factorize a complicated situation into something like this. And then report depends only on leaving. And again, alarm and smoke are independent given we have the knowledge of whether there's a fire and whether the alarm system has been tampered. Going to the subject of decision making, this is a central task for an agent. It has to make decisions. That's why we design agents and robots. They have to make decisions on their own and to complete tasks, even if the task is to entertain you. But in a more serious domain, for example, there could be autonomous robots scanning the walls in an underground mining situation and looking for defects or cracks in certain rock formations. So that's a very serious situation, but the robot has to make decisions. Should I rescan this part of the rock formation, or am I certain that there's a crack here? Because it has a certain task and a certain amount of time and resources available to it. Or it could have to decide, should I return to the base and refill my batteries because I'm running low on energy? These are important decisions. So in any case, decision making is a central theme in artificial intelligence, and to each action there is associated a certain value or preference. And given these values and preferences, agents decide on what they should do next. And also, an agent needs to know preconditions for what is possible, and it needs to know what the effects of its actions are. It needs to know what the expected observations would be given certain actions. And then it can decide on its next action. Obviously, there are many very well-studied algorithms for making these decisions. And if one wants to decide on a whole sequence of actions, we call it planning. And once again, there's a whole separate subfield of artificial intelligence that considers planning in uncertain domains, which is a very interesting domain on its own. Here we see a diagram that is an extension of the belief network I showed you just now, but this time it's called a decision network because here we see these blocks, these two blocks, which represent actions that can be chosen by the agent. So given a possible fire, the agent has to decide, should it physically check whether there's smoke and not necessarily just trust the smoke detector, and should it make a call to the fire brigade to come and extinguish the fire. So one might ask, so why don't you just have the agent check the smoke in any case, check it for itself and make sure? This is because the agent might have to go into the building where the fire is to go and check whether there's smoke, and if it's if the robot is very expensive, its designers might have designed it so that it doesn't put itself into unnecessary harm, and then the company has to replace the robot for a few €1,000. And one might ask, well, why doesn't it just call the fire brigade anyway? Well, if it's a false alarm, then the company whose robot it is might have to pay a hefty fine for a false alarm, calling the fire brigade unnecessarily. And here we see that the actions are linked to the utilities diamond, and here are the values for certain actions, and it's also influenced by whether there is actually a fire. So the values are affected by whether the agent actually thinks there is a fire. Further themes in artificial intelligence. Okay, my 25 minutes are up. So, and just I think on my second last slide, so I'll try to speed up now. Further themes are learning. So an agent or a robot has to learn. I mean, this is what we call intelligence after all. We aren't just stagnant, and we don't just keep the same knowledge we always have. Neural networks you might have heard of. These are algorithms and mathematical models. They are based on how the neurons work in humans and animals, and we basically use our brain or our wetware to make decisions, and people have been so clever to try and model how humans do it. Fuzzy logic concerns how to represent vague or fuzzy concepts, for example, height. So different people might have different ideas of what is tall or what is short. And in a more practical sense, in Japan, and I'm certain in Germany as well, some trains are controlled to a certain degree using fuzzy logic controllers. And that is, they use concepts like slow and fast and stop and full speed, and they translate them into a mechanical signal that can be used to control the speed of a train. So for example, if a train is approaching a station at fast, then the system suddenly switches to slow, you don't want the train to jerk suddenly. You want it to gradually move from fast to slow, and fuzzy reasoning controllers do this quite nicely. Going to genetic algorithms, the theory of evolution is used here, and scientists have looked at concepts in genetics, for example, the mutation of genes and the concept of the survival of the fittest to solve problems. Swarm intelligence concerns looking at biology, for example, schools of fish or swarms of birds or bees, and even ants and bacteria have been looked at to try and extract some information from nature to solve problems we have in everyday life. So this is my last slide. What is an ultimate agent? It should keep up to date with the environment. It should learn at different levels, verschiedenen Ebenen. So it should learn, for example, on a physical level, how to behave in certain conditions. It should learn on a knowledge level, so it should gain new knowledge, for example, now the light is off or now the fan is on. And it should learn at a more abstract level, that is, it's learning rules for how to act in the world. For example, if there's a precipice in front of you, you do not move forward. It should be able to adapt to new situations, which is again a kind of learning. It should be able to react quickly and to new circumstances, for example, especially if there are dangerous circumstances like, for example, a vehicle is approaching the agent, or in an agent or a robot that is doing a tour in a museum, and a child is running towards it, the agent should suddenly stop and not move its limbs so it doesn't endanger anybody. And it should do it quickly. It should be able to deal well with uncertainty and with noise in its data and its sensors. Entscheidungen on the fly treffen, that is, make decisions wegen des Fluges. Thank you, that wasn't that. It should be able to complete its tasks effectively and completely, and it should be able to consider its environment around it, and especially the human beings in that environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions, please. I mean, the last thing you just said about the ultimate agent is the person, isn't it?
Basically, we are the ultimate agent.
So, do we have questions?
If I have no questions, then I'm very glad I've explained everything perfectly.
I don't quite understand the mathematical and cognitive knowledge of this artificial intelligence. So I have a very, very simple and full stupid question. So what does the most human-like robots can do? What does most human-like robot in intelligence can do?
Well, the Asimo robot developed by Honda is for me one of the best kinds of robots that you can see at present. It can walk around and avoid obstacles, it can interact with people, it can even ask questions and answer questions and give answers, but all within limited domains. So it cannot just simply go out into the street and survive and book a flight for you at a travel agent. It has a certain domain that it's working on, but these are the early days of robotics and artificial intelligence, and it's quite, when one sees it, you almost think it might be a little person in there if you use your imagination. And I've also seen examples of an arm, but it's not part of a body, it's just an arm, that can catch a ball that is thrown towards it. So if someone throws a ball, it can catch it. And it can play some games like this little paddle and ball, it can play with that without making a mistake. So these are good examples of almost human behavior.
So can it think in a very simple logical way, like human?
No, I think there's a whole field of artificial intelligence called common sense reasoning. So that is something that humans take for granted. We take for granted that when you put something down on a table, that it will just stay there if you don't move it. But a robot has to be told that if you don't do something to an object, that nothing will change. And this is common sense to us. But it actually takes a lot of effort to model this idea of things not changing. And there's actually a whole problem, and it was a big issue for many years just to model that things don't change. It's a stupid thing for robots, but that just shows you we still need humans to do a lot of the thinking work for us.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, here's one.
It's not completely regard artificial, but regard the probability. You got a good example of open video, maybe it's the most simple example. But my question is, of course, probability need for some, at least the lowest level of some standards, you depend on it, or some predicted events in order to be involved in your equations or new calculations. But The question is what in case that the system is almost, or the event is almost randomly, and you have the lowest number of standards and the lowest number of predicted events. So the question is, there is any limit that, okay, you decide the calculation of probability for the system will be useless, so I will not depend on probability calculations. I mean, when you will decide that you are resigned from calculating probability?
There are researchers that prefer not to use probabilities to model uncertainties, but I must say that the majority of roboticists and engineers do use the theory of probability because it's so well studied. And yes, another problem with modeling problems with probabilities is that people say, but where do you get the probabilities? How do you know what the probabilities are? And this is something to do with learning as well. So you might give a system the very basics of probabilities, like 50-50.